Welcome everyone. I am Kyle Cook. I will be leading this meeting, going over equity and patronage in our leverage solution. A little bit about myself and Leverage is that we were founded in 2018 in Barnesville, Minnesota. We are comprised of experts in agriculture and technology. And really, we've been working on these problems around agriculture and equity for about 6 years in total. Objectives today is to kind of go over our equity app and patronage. So a lot of times those get intermingled, equity and patronage for us, and different clients call it one thing or the other. We'll refer it today as equity and patronage. And for the most part, we're going to talk a little bit about member management, how we kind of manage our members inside of our equity app. We'll also talk about stock management, which goes hand in hand with the members, which stock is around what members actually own part of the that are part of the organization that own stock in it. And some organizations that use our equity and patronage app don't actually use stock as well. So you can have it or not have it. We'll also talk about the equity, which involves allocations, revolvements, taxes. An allocation is just essentially allocating money left over from business to members. Our revolvements are essentially payouts to those members. So a member might get allocated money, and then we might revolve it or pay it years down the road, or it could be the same year. So it depends. We'll get into that. We'll talk about estate management and some other resources. So I'm going to bring up our equity screen real quick. So this is what our UI looks like. This is our landing page for logging in. I'll go ahead and log in real quick. And we are two-step authentication. So I will then get a message to my phone. One extra zero there. We finish logging in. So this takes us to our home screen. This is kind of our landing page in the equity app. In equity, I'll kind of walk you through the entire process flow from beginning to end as far as setup and what's kind of expected. So, and I'll kind of go through a unique scenario of some of the requirements we've seen from companies to companies. So if we look at this, the first thing you'll kind of do is set up members, right? So the first thing that most users are going to do is set up members. And a lot of times members go through kind of a pre-qualified process to join either co-op or an organization. And that's typically handled outside the system. Sometimes that pre-qualification might go to the board members of the board to decide, or other leadership teams. But if you do have a new member, right, you can go ahead and here and hit add data and then hit new to start creating a new member. We have some critical fields in here, which is the account types. Are they an entity or an individual? You can name it whatever you want. Our system will give it an account number, and it'll do that whether you import it via a data migration functionality. And then we also contain an external account number. We built this software to be used independent of any ERP or other type of financial accounting software. So whatever you might call your customer in your ERP, let's say, you can put that number in here, and we use this field throughout the system. You can also hook up your account number in here to be the same as your ERP, but sometimes people want them separate, so we have both. You fill out the information around taxes, their email and phone number. Those are critical for if you're going to use our portal, because that is the way that they can log in to their equity and patronage portal to see what's going on. We have additional flags around party voting, if they're a voting party. So can they vote if we have votes coming up for proxy voting? And then just your basic kind of address stuff. When you create a member, they will now exist in this grid that you can look at. And that's where that external account number is typically what we have people wanting to look at, is to see that number instead of memorizing two different numbers. In here, if you ever need to go in there, you can go in, open back up, look at that member and kind of see what's going on with that member. On this as well, you can change some of their information. but we also have additional information around their bank information if we are going to be paying them via some type of automated payout like Stripe. We also have in here, which is probably the most commonly used form, is the equity and stock form. So on this form, when you come in here, this kind of tells you the story of what's going on with this member. It's year over year, so you have 2024, and you have equity dividends, and then you have this section called, it's not actually called transfer, and I'll talk you through this, and then section 199A. So what this section's telling us right here is this is all the equity that Bruce Wayne has. And equity is essentially allocations paid out over the years. For some co-ops, they will pay out every year all of their equity. And so they won't really have a balance year over year. Other co-ops we've seen will actually hold on to equity and not pay it out for 30 years sometimes. And typically we'll see between 20 and 10 years is probably the most common, but a lot of this equity will stay here for years on end. And we have a transfer button, which we'll get into a little bit later, but this is essentially their total equity. Over here breaks down year over year, so this just happens to be that they only have that they've only been allocated the $5,559.15 in 2024. But you can go back through and see every year of their individual equity for that. You can also see their dividends. So this is where some of that terminology comes into play. A dividend, revolvement, they kind of go interchanging. But when you revolve equity, which is a payout, you will show up in this dividend, the payout for that year. Okay, down here you will see shares owned, which we'll get into a little bit later in just a minute, actually. And then down here's kind of the categories of what makes up the equity. Typically with patronage and equity, you might have different categories. So you might say, we're going to allocate X amount of dollars per every dollar of chemical someone buys, or for every dollar of whatever they sell, they will allocate back. And they could be different amounts per category. You can have an unlimited amount of categories set up here. In this example, we're using an agriculture co-op, so chemical, fertilizer, seed. They might have, this is for this customer, what they bought that year. And then when we do an allocation, we can allocate how much per quantity will be given to them. Okay. On this, we also have some functionality around patronage splits. The patronage splits piece we'll get into maybe a little later. That's pretty deep into the system. And I don't know if we'll have a full amount of time to go into it. But for the most part, this is the customer setup, and this is the customer page where a user can see what a customer balance is, total equity balance, which is right here, what their year over year balances are, so they can scroll through and see that, as well as scroll through and see all the categories that make up what could be in their allocation. Okay. We also have stock certificates. So sometimes, not every company does this, but we have functionality around stock certificates that if you are issuing stock, which we'll get into in just a second, we can print them off and save them in here. And then we also have tax forms if you are printing and using this system to do your PATR reporting. So that's your customer basic setup. It's relatively simple. Now let's talk about if there are stock involved. So if you have stock, we kind of showed you that we have the ability, let me go to it real quick, to set up as many different stock classes as you would like. A lot of times companies, co-ops will merge, right? So you might have 3 different co-ops, they might merge together, and this is not uncommon, and they might all have a different class of stock. And so we might call it A, B, and C, and they're all technically 3 different companies, or 3 different times that a company could issue the stock, but they want to track it differently. Well, you can create as many as you want. And a lot of times members might not actually be required to own stock to participate in your equity allocations and payouts. And that's where we have maybe a concept of a common stock, which is kind of, it can be classified as like no stock as well, but we still use it for allocations and calculations. And like I said, you can track the amount of the initial stock value for each. These are important because these do get assigned over to the customers as we go. So if we go back to our member, you'll see here that Bruce Wayne has a common stock. He has 55 of the quantity of common stock. A lot of times some members will hold multiple different stocks and they will be in here, held in here that they can see. On the stock piece, we have functionality around transferring. So some companies don't do transfers; they just take the stock back to the company itself. But some companies will transfer and say, "Hey, you know, these have been issued out. You can sell them if you want, and do what you want with those." So if you do that, we have the ability to transfer that stock by coming into here, and you can kind of pick the class if they have multiple stocks that they own and pick what they want, and then who they want to transfer it to. With that being said, in agriculture specifically, but other industries, sometimes you'll have liens on your members. So if a member had a lien, we have functionality that you could stop the transfer of stock. So Kyle had a loan out to the bank. I have a lien on my account. I want to try to, defraud the bank, let's say. We would be able to stop them by not letting that stock transfer happen and go to another customer. So we have that functionality right here. The stock is important. It adds functionality when we actually start allocating stuff out. Again, some companies might have no stock concept at all. We're all members of the company. And in that case, we would just assign a common stock to everyone at a $0 value and then just run all our allocations on that versus other companies. Each stock might get a different dollar amount allocated to them. Okay. So that is the stock allocation with that. So before I go any further, are there any questions on customer setup or stock setup? Okay. I see anything in the chat either. So we will continue. All of this, we have functionality around importing. So if maybe a company doesn't do a lot of equity all but once a year, you can quickly just import this instead of setting stuff up. So you can import accounts, transactions, shares, allocations, pretty much anything we do inside the system, and we just use a CSV to be able to do that. It's relatively quick and simple to import that information via this. You can also do it manually. So if we come forward, we've got our customer set up. We have our stock set up on our customers. Then we can actually start talking about allocations. So this is where each company does it different. And we've tried to build this as flexible as possible so that any company can use it with minor tweaks, if any at all. So we call it an allocation. So you come in here and you can see we've already got some allocations created in here. So I'll just open one up and let you see. But basically, you can name your allocation whatever you want. So typically, let's just talk about, we'll use an ag co-op specifically, but imagine any company that you do. An ag co-op, for example, might just do an allocation once a year for patronage. And in that case, they could call it, 2024 PATR allocation. They could pick the share class that they want it for. You can also leave that blank on that share class, but let's say they picked class A, they could do that. They could pick if they wanted it to be for a specific person. And that comes critical when it comes to estate planning, which we'll talk to in a bit. But otherwise, they would just leave that blank and then they could pick a category. Okay, so for fertilizer, for this type of stock class, for as well as the type of allocation. So we have the concept of a per unit retains, which is the most common, as well as the patronage. And let me back up. Patronage is the most common. Per unit retains also common. But the difference is usually per unit retains doesn't always get paid out. It could sit there for a lot longer and maybe not ever get paid out at all, whereas patronage does get paid out. And this is more just reporting purposes and as well as where it lands on the customer when they look at it. You pick the period for which you want to do it, the source, which you'd only have one per company. And then whether it was a purchase or a sell, this doesn't do other anything as far as the functionality of it goes. It just lets the user know, was it for the selling of the product or the purchasing of the product? And then the distribution type of qualified or non-qualified, which can be used on taxes later. And here is where you put in the rate. So in this case, it might be that, hey, for every pound of fertilizer, which is set up on the category, you decide what that unit of measure is, we're going to pay out $1.50 in equity. And then once you do that, you can save it. And won't actually save this one, but you can save it and then run that equity. And the way you do that is you click on these three ellipses over here, and you can, these ones have already been generated, but you have, if you didn't have generate, you'd have a generate button that would generate it. Once it's generated, you can then open this up and click download. So from there, you can download, put it up, what was actually allocated, which you should be able to see here. So this shows you the allocation, and this is demo data, right? So we're dealing with fake information, but you'll see that they had a beginning balance of 0. We had no other equity in there before. We adjusted their equity to this much, and now this is our current balance for that. And then it kind of tells you what the allocation period is. What's nice about this is we have, when you do the generate, you have the ability to do a demo and just run allocation scenarios to see what it would be. And then you also have the ability to post it. So these ones are actually posted, but I can still at any moment just go in there and download the Excel and see what the amount was. I can also always just undo the generate. So if at some point, even after I've allocated it, we realize something was wrong, we could undo the generate. Now, depending where you're on the process, the undoing could be a lot more difficult than just clicking a button. Because if you paid it, we're not going to allow you to just go undo the generate. That wouldn't make sense. You've already paid it out. You'd have to reverse the payment, you'd have to reverse the revolvement, and then you'd have to reverse this allocation. What's nice about this, like I said, is you can do an allocation per category, per year, per stock. It's super flexible in that sense. And what I think's the greatest value of that is as companies grow, right? These co-ops or anyone using equity and patronage, they're not stagnant companies. Their industry changes, the things that happen in the industry change. And a lot of times the board will change stuff. And what we've seen in the industry is someone might custom code around their current equity requirements of, hey, we need to be able to calculate this amount. And they might start to hard code stuff in there. The problem with that is the board will change. And now all the stuff that was done prior no longer works, and you have to do a lot more coding. We recognize that as a problem, and that's why we built this to have the flexibility of saying, hey, you can pick any class. Your board wants to issue new shares of class, a stock, awesome. Go create another one. If you want to do a new category, great, go do it. You want to do a new amount, you can change it. It's very flexible in that, and there's very rare we've seen where it won't work to the customer's needs. We have seen it. We do get some unique requirements, but they're usually relatively simple to fix because of how flexible we made this. Okay. When you allocate, if I go back to the members real quick, that is what shows up here under Bruce Wayne, under his equity. So that 5,559, that came from that allocation. And it shows up here, and it will show up here in his total equity balance. Okay. So that's essentially the allocation, just for some understanding, right? Maybe for those that are on the call that might not be familiar with allocations in general. Typically, a board will decide how much they're going to allocate. And sometimes it's just set, and everyone just knows every year we're allocating X amount. But the board usually determines the allocation amount. The categories are defined usually beforehand as far as what items or what things you are going to allocate against. And then you'd run this once a year, sometimes a handful of times a year. So that is kind of the allocation process of giving users equity. Now let's go back to the member real quick and look at this. There's sometimes that members, just like their shares, they want to transfer their equity. That's why this button up here says transfer. So if they wanted to transfer that equity, we have the functionality built around this. Right now, this user has 5,559. Well, we've come across some really unique requirements around equity transfers. And so we tried to make this as flexible as possible. So a user could say, I want to transfer all of it. And that might happen. Let's say you have two companies that are members of your co-op that say, hey, we're going to merge, but we'll just use company A's account and we'll move everything over to company B. So you could, in theory, just click all and move company B's to A's, all of their equity. When you pick all, it's going to be all of the equity involved. You could pick an allocation. So maybe we've had requirements where someone will say, I only want to move the year 1995's allocation for fertilizer over to this person. Again, we've seen these types of requirements, and in that case, you could actually pick an allocation and then go pick which one you want to move over to that other customer. A percentage, so maybe you say, I want to allocate 25% of all my equity to this person. You could do that. And then you could also do a specified amount and just say, how much do you actually want to move over? Again, you pick who the recipient of that would be, and then you could transfer that equity. Not every co-op does that. That's more of a, I would say, an agriculture thing that we've seen, but other co-ops do. I think the biggest part of the transfer for other co-ops is the transfer when there's a consolidation between two companies or a joining of two companies, a merger. So that is the transfer of equity and really equity allocation for a user. Again, the allocation is based on the category. So this user had these values brought in. You then create an allocation. You pick the category you're going to allocate it against and a dollar amount, and then you run it, and then that gives you your equity. This equity, if you notice, this has three categories. It doesn't break out each of these. It would be a combination of all of them. We do have reporting that can break it out, but up here on the quick glance, they would see all of it. What's nice is in our customer portal, they'd be able to see this on their customer account. They can see year over year their equity, any of your members as they go. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about unit retains. Unit retains as well. It's very similar to equity. It would actually, well, it is equity. It's just patronage is part of the equity and unit retains is the other. If you had per unit retains, it would also show up in this equity balance account right here. And there's really nothing else unique about the per unit retains in here other than a lot of times, like I said, co-ops won't revolve those out quickly with that. So again, process, have a member created. Do they have stock? If you have stock, great, you need to create the stock. If you don't, we just use a common stock concept. Once you have that, the next step is to upload your transactions in there, which is just a simple CSV file. We are working on an integration to be able to bring it in for D365 F&O. Once you've got the transactions in there, you then next have to do the allocation, which we just talked about and showed, which our system, what's nice, always stores that Excel file. You can always download and view year over year, which to me is extremely beneficial, right? We're still a newer company at this, but a lot of these companies have been paying equity for 30, 40 years, and it would be nice if you could quickly just come in, find that allocation, download it, and hand it off to someone rather than, I don't even know how some of them would do it 30 years from now, going in the back in the history. Okay, so you have the allocation. Now it comes time for the revolvement or the payout when you're actually going to pay on this. We have in here, you would go into equity and you could go into revolvements. So this is just demo revolvement again, but I'll just do an open screen real quick. So if you were going to create a new revolvement, which again, we've got the allocation, we've now been told, okay, go pay this. You come in here, you hit new, you call the payout whatever you want, 2024 revolvement or payout, if you did it once a year. You would then pick the source again. This, we actually have a default in our settings. It's just not turned on right now. And then you pick the revolvement period. If, excuse me, yes, you pick the revolvement period. You pick the class of share involved, and then you can pick to revolve out a specific allocation period, or you can just leave it blank, meaning we've seen it where people will say, no, we just want to roll out all allocations up to a certain dollar amount. We've also seen it where they just want to revolve out a certain allocation period. And that's where we get into that flexibility stuff again, because board of directors will change how they want to do this. So, for example, if you wanted to pay out a certain period allocation, you could go in, pick the period allocation and the allocation itself, which I don't think 2024 is the one we had. Yeah. So you could pick a specific one you wanted to pay out. We have customers that have wanted to do that. We've also had customers say, no, I want you just to pay. I'm going to give you an X amount of dollars and I just want you to pay it out. And so down here, you could pick a dollar amount and just type in, because if the board says you can pay out $1 million, they could come down in here, type it out, put a dollar amount and go forward. In here, we also have the ability to do it per contact. So per customer essentially, which is during an estate payout, or again, if there's a merger or a company closeout, whatever it might be, you can do a revolvement for them specifically. And that's where all comes in. As if, let's say, Barry Allen passed away, you could pick allocation type all, hit that flag of revolve out all allocations, and then run it, and it would pay out everything for that user. Again, once you have that created, very similar, we have the same thing. It would be generate. We have a generate button that's going to go ahead and generate that allocation. And it's just the math going through and picking, okay, are we revolving out all? Are we revolving out an allocation? Are we revolving out a dollar amount? It does all that math, puts it together, and then puts it in an Excel file, and also puts it as a payout. Again, very similar to the allocations. What's wonderful about this is you have the ability to download that. And you can download this at any time in the history again. Let it open up. There it is. So it downloads and it shows you what is the amount it's going to do. Again, this is a simple Excel file. What's nice is you can quickly do analysis on this. So maybe your board says, hey, you know, we want to revolve around $1 million. How much would that be for Peter Quill? Because it's important that we make him happy. They revolve it. Oh, it's not enough. We need to up it, whatnot. There's a lot of different what if scenarios you can do with your allocations that we have in here, and your revolvement with that. Again, the net benefit of this is you can quickly undo what you did. So I could hit undo generate. It would reverse all that revolvement and move forward. So this just generates a revolvement, which puts it into this payment table. So you have the allocation, you revolve it, it puts it into a payment table, and it doesn't actually update that something was paid until we get back from your ERP system or however you're going to pay it that, hey, we paid it on this date. When you give us that, that is when we know, okay, it's paid, lower their equity amount, and put it in that dividend section, which I'll show you in just a second. But in this case, right, you do that revolvement, and then the user would come in here and hit download. And it's downloading. And it would download the Excel file for this to then go be put into the ERP system. So they download this. We might have to move around based on each ERP system. Oh, there it goes. Well, paid it out. Downloaded it. Took a second. We might have to move it around based on each ERP system to do this, or you can just even do a macro to basically get it to import correctly. We built it to import to Dynamics 365 the easiest, since that's the ERP we mainly work with, being a D365 partner ourselves. But essentially you download this and then this gets imported in as an invoice on each one of those vendors. So each one of these people would be a vendor. They might be a member customer that you're selling to, but you'd have to put them up in a vendor. And then once they're in there as a vendor, you import this invoice, and then it just is part of the regular payable process. You could pick the terms of when you wanted to pay in the ERP system and move forward and the mode. Once you finished, right, if you pay them all out, we have the ability to import it in. So you can have that file that was downloaded, and then let's say you paid it the 12th, you could put the 12 in there, save it, hit import, because a lot of times we're talking 600, 700 potential lines in here or more. So you could put the date in there, hit import, it would update the payment date, as well as the reference information like the check number or ACH information that was involved in there. So all of that would happen. Again, there's a lot of information in here, but if there was a lien on this, we would also be able to print the lien on there so that, if Barry Allen had a lien, it would print Barry Allen and his lien holders on the checks that go to him if they want it. Because we have flexibility that they might want a lien, but the lien holder doesn't actually want to be printed on the check. They trust their partner enough on that. We have seen that. So this is the payout. As soon as you pay that out, if you go back to the members, that is when it shows up in here as a dividend paid, is once we've actually get back from the ERP system that it's been paid to the user. So that's kind of the payout on that revolvement and equity piece. We also have functionality around taxes. If you want to be able to calculate your PATR tax forms in here, they're extremely beneficial for that. And then to kind of go over a couple of other things with the estate, again, we have that functionality, which is just the equity. You'd be able to create a revolvement. And in that revolvement, you would just pick, I'll just look at this one. You would pick an actual contact, a specific account, essentially, and then revolve all, and that would be your estate payout for that. A lot of times, estate planning, it's kind of a benefit to that person, right? That to say, hey, we'll give you all of this. Typically we might not give it to you until 20 years. So we'll revolve all of it and do you this favor since it's an estate thing, but we're only going to give you 80%. This is very common. So we have the ability to put that percentage in there on those all revolvements to only pay a percentage of the total equity. The remaining equity gets remained with the company and they keep it as kind of a, we're helping you out by paying this all out now rather than 20 years, 30 years into the future. So that's essentially the estate planning. There's a lot more details into that, but that's essentially it. We talked about lien holders. We have lien holders on stock, equity, and payment functionality. Leaseholders, leasing is something we have seen. We still are lacking a little bit of functionality on the lease things. It's not as common to see leases, but we have it conceptualized, and we have certain pieces of it. What was the other thing I'm going to show you? On the categories themselves, like I said, what's nice about it, and this is all demo data, but as the board changes, right, kind of what I talked about, what's the benefit of the flexibility is we can always add a new category at any time when the board wants to do something new. So maybe they might want to start tracking application, essentially. So those that do application should be able to get additional I'll say pound, get an additional payout of equity. So you can quickly create that application. You can then import transactions against it. So the user would then work throughout the year on it. You can import the transaction for the application and then be able to go into an allocation and allocate against that type of category of application now. So extremely flexible in that sense, which we've found to be extremely useful for all of our users of this system. Okay, so up to this point, this is where we're at. The next piece I wanted to kind of show you. Any questions, I guess, before I move on? I don't see anything in the chat. So let's go ahead and go to our news. So again, if you had the portal for their customers, you can print and share news in here on the side. When they log in, they'd also be able to see this to be able to add news in there. So maybe it's, hey, again, speaking the agriculture slant, maybe you put in here, hey, remember all prepays are due X amount if you want the discount that's involved with the prepay. Whatever you might want to put in there, you could put in here and delete those news pieces in here. Not every member we anticipate to log in that often. Most of the time it might just be they want to check their balance. But it's still there as a nice feature to have just in case. We also have this concept of a voting period, which essentially is the ability to vote and get feedback from members. So to me, common uses of this is you might be voting on a board member. Hey, we got a new board. We're going to vote on the board members. Go ahead and set it up. You also might be able to vote on a resolution. So resolution might be a handful of things. And I think I was talking to a prospective client that we could also use this for the ability to get information back from their members, right? I think that one client, they wanted to get certain information about what the user had, what some of their members had. And so maybe we create a resolution that says, hey, tell us how many items of X you have and send it back. This could be used for that, in my opinion. And what you do is you can create as many different resolutions and voting on board members as you want. And it's very flexible, right? You can call it whatever you want, free lines for everyone. Does everyone agree? You can then send it out to the members and they can input the value of that and send it back. Each member can only vote once without having it reset. And then all that data comes back into the app for the users to look at and make decisions on based on that, or take it back to the board for the voting. It's all locked down again, security. So I can only vote because I have my password as well as the double authentication with my phone. So it's trusted in that sense that you shouldn't ever have any problems with security breaches for the most part on that. If I come back to our home, we talked a little about stock, categories, members, equity, allocations, and our importing functionality. The last thing I'll kind of show a little bit is maybe let's look at the sources. So this is in the cloud, all of this, and we have it functioning so that multiple different types of companies can use this. So some of the stuff we have the ability to enable and disable based on that. So the source, you saw the source on some of the other forms. You set it up as Levridge. You can kind of pick what type of ERP system is being used. Not a big deal for the most part for most people. We have some threshold payout amounts that are in here. We have a default stock. I think I was mentioning that earlier. So if the case is that, hey, we don't actually have stock, so we'll just give everyone common stock. This way, no one ever really has to touch the stock class again. They can just burn through all the other allocations and revolvement because we only have common stock. Like I said, we have some pre-entertained processing config in here. We have an employer ID number. This is used on the tax reporting form. So if you are going to use our tax reporting, you'd have to put in your number in here, and then it would print on the tax forms. We have period configurations of just kind of what are your date ranges. Maybe you have a different year end than others. Here we have an ability to disable splits. Not everyone uses splits. In fact, I'd say it's actually a smaller percentage of users using splits on this. And then we have the ability to disable taxes, enable liens, enable stock certificate number going back to the stocks if you actually use the certificates. The address in here is critical for the tax printing if you are going to use it. It is in there. So this is kind of the setup form of that. We have the ability as well to change the color. So every company can change the color that they want, the logo they have up here. All of that is flexible. Go into my settings real quick. Yep, we have the ability to change some of our terms and conditions that can print on some of our stuff. Again, the logo can be updated here. And for the most part, there's some more tax stuff in here around specified co-op or not for tax reporting purposes. But for the most part, this is kind of our setup screen where you can download stuff, create new users. If you were going to create a new user in here, we have the ability to do that, as well as configure our periods, which we kind of talked about a little bit earlier. This is kind of our UI for the most part. It's really quick. It's quite easy to navigate and quite easy actually to understand, I think, the flow of it overall. So that being said, that kind of wraps up for the most part the presentation of what our system offers. And I wanted to open it up for questions or comments that people might have.